Okay, it's now May 7th, I think. Is it May 7th? May 7th. So we are roughly 6 weeks removed from the end of the school year. So as we progress towards that final date of June 25th or 4th, we are now into review mode. So these questions here that we have 18 questions. 9 in the first page, 9 in the second. These are good review questions for you to practice your basic skills of grade 8 math. So as we do these, if you're doing these down the road sometime, like in June, and you're practicing this video, just press pause right now, try the questions, and then press unpause and see how well you did. Same thing with the next 9 questions as well. So the first question is a coordinate geometry question. It says, what are the coordinates and what is the length of AB? So the first thing you need to do is be able to write the coordinates as ordered pairs. In ordered pairs, you always put your x-coordinate first and your y-coordinate second. Your x-axis is your horizontal, and your y-axis is your vertical. So the first thing when I read A, I look for where is it on this axis. And that point A is at -3 on the x-axis. Now on the y-axis, I have to look left or right of the y-axis to see where that A point is. And it is left of this point right here, which is 0. So on the y-axis, A would be 0. Excuse me. B, on the x-axis, right here, this one here, it is above this point here, which means it is 1 on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, it is right of the point 2. And finally, point C is 1 on the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis. Now the next point, what is the length of AB, is a question that requires just a little bit of thought. And when you connect the dots, what you will see here is if I drag this down here, oh no, wrong thing to drag. If I drag this down here, what you end up having is a right triangle. And AB is really the hypotenuse of that right triangle. So when we measure the legs, we can see here that between B and C it's 1, 2 positions, so it's 2 units long. From A to C it's 1, 2, 3, 4 units long, and X. So what we really have is a 2, 4X triangle. Like we used to do when we studied Pythagoras for all those many days, is we would attach squares to the legs and we would write the areas of both of those squares inside. So Pythagoras said the sum of those two is the area of the square attached to the hypotenuse. So therefore, the answer to the question, what is the length of AB? The exact answer is the square root of 20. And the approximate answer is 4 point, probably 5-ish. I could use a calculator to actually do a better job of calculating that. But if I take the square root of 20, 4.47, which is roughly 4.5. Your second question gives you an algebra question. And we have a constant, and we have a coefficient, and we have a variable. So the first thing we're going to do is get rid of our constant, which is -12, by adding 12 to both sides. And when we add 12 to this side, we still have a -2x. A lot of people just put 2x there when they make mistakes. But that subtraction sign actually stays with the coefficient. It becomes a -2x equals the sum of these two. So 12 positives combined with 8 negatives makes 4 positives. Now in order to isolate the variable to get rid of the coefficient, I have to divide both sides by -2. A common mistake is they think they have to divide by a +2, but we've studied many times that you have to divide by the exact same coefficient to get rid of it. And x would therefore equal 4 divided by -2, which is -2. In the next example, we have a constant, and we have a coefficient and a variable. First thing I do is get rid of that 3 by subtracting 3 from both sides. I end up with this. So I end up with a -1/4 x equals -1. Now there's 3 different ways you can write that. You can write it the way I just wrote it up top. You can write it this way, or you can write it this way. Of all 3 choices, the one that we tried to get you to write that as was to put your negative sign in your denominator, and the reason why is when I write it that way, I know to isolate I'm going to have to multiply both sides by -4 because I'm very used to this idea right there. X equals the product of -1 and -4, which is a +4. Your next question is your last of your 3 different algebra questions. This time we're using distributive property. What I'll do here is I actually copy this twice, infinite clone or clone it. And the reason why I'm going to do it twice is because there's 2 ways to solve this. Put my line down the middle. The first way is to expand using distributive property. So negative 5 times x is negative 5x. And a negative 5 times a negative 3 is a positive 15. So that positive really acts as my operation sign of negative 5x plus 15 equals 100. I now have a 2-step algebraic equation. Subtract to get rid of my constant. The sum of these two is a positive 85. And then I'm simply going to divide by my coefficient to get x equals a negative 17. Now, alternatively, because it's distributive property, instead of expanding distributive property, I can say if I have negative 5 groups of x minus 3, if I divide that by negative 5 and that by negative 5, the idea of dividing or multiplying or doing one side of something to an equation and the other, same thing to the other, maintains equality, results in one group of x minus 3 will equal negative 20. And once I have that equation, it's much simpler to isolate. I get x equals negative 17. Okay, so I guess the key to that is when you have distributive property, there are 2 ways you could solve it. You can expand it, like we did here, or you could divide both sides by the multiplier to get this instead. It's up to you. Your next question is simply a bed mass question involving integers. So technically, I could have put brackets around there and then put it divided by negative 2 here, and that's probably a better way to write that whole question. It means the same thing. It means do that first, and then once you get that, divide your whole answer by negative 2. So when I do that, I'm not going to do this subtraction yet. I'm going to do the product of this, which is negative 6. I'm still not going to do the subtraction. I'm going to do the product of these two, which is positive 24. I now have subtraction, which means I keep the first integer, change it to addition, and use the opposite, which will give me negative 34, divided by that negative 2 now, because now I have simplified my brackets, and I end up with a positive 17, or just 17. Your next question is the start of your fraction questions. It's 1 3/5 divided by a whole number 4. And the reason why we did this question, this is one of the questions we did a lot wrong, is because we have to think of it as being this question. 1 3/5, sorry, not multiplied by, divided by 4 over 1. And the reason why it's important to think of whole numbers as fractions over 1 is because it helps us with our algorithm. So now we know that the way we're going to solve this is change this to improper, change division to multiplication, and use the reciprocal of a quarter. Now, dividing by 4 is the same thing as multiplying by a quarter. A quarter of a number is the same thing as dividing it into 4 parts. Once I have that, I can use cross reduction if I wanted. I would get 2 over 5 as my answer. If I didn't cross reduce, I would get 8 over 20, and then I would have to reduce this by 4 to get 2 over 5 still. Either way, I'm still going to get 2/5 as my answer. The next question is a fraction question, this time with bed mass. So I'm not going to do my addition first, but I am going to do this multiplication here. So the easiest way to multiply mixed fractions is to convert them both to improper. Multiply your numerators, multiply your denominators. And I'm not going to change it back to mixed. I'm going to keep it as improper. So 1 1/4 times 1 1/4 is 25/16. Once we are adding, we know we have to transition into the idea of common denominators for adding and subtracting. That will stay the same. This will become an equivalent fraction of 6/16. Add your numerators to get 31. Keep your denominator 16. And the final step would be convert that back down to 1 and 15/16. Your next question is dividing a mixed fraction by a fraction. Same rules apply. Always change your mixed fractions to improper. Change your division to multiplication and use the reciprocal of 1/5. Now that you have it as multiplication, multiply your numerators to get 25, multiply your denominators to get 2, and your answer will be 12 and a half. And your final question, I think, on the first side of the sheet is an order of operations question. 10 take away 3 1/5 times 2. So I'm not going to do my subtraction. I am going to do my multiplication. So that's 16/5 times 2, which is 32/5. All right, 32/5. Now, since I have a whole number here, I have some options. I'm going to keep my 10 as 10. I'm not going to change that. Because technically I could just go 10 take away 6 2/5. And if I did that, because this is 6 2/5, 10 take away 6 2/5, mentally I can do that without doing any algorithm. I just can do it in my head. That would end up with 3 3/5. I could do it that way. But because most of us are tied into algorithms, I'm just going to put 32/5 here and try and figure this out. So when I'm subtracting, I need a common denominator. Now 10 is really the same thing as 10 over 1. And 10 over 1 as a common denominator of 5 is really 50 over 5. So 10 over 1 and 50 over 5 are the same fraction. Subtract your numerators, you get 18 over 5, which is still going to be 3 3/5. Most people make the mistake of these two parts here, thinking of 10 as being 10 over 1 and thinking as being equivalent fraction of 50 over 5. The second part of this sheet was the other parts of the grade 8 curriculum, and we're going to do those now. So these are the questions. If you want to press pause here, you can press pause and try these questions, and then I'll show you how to do the answers. All right, your first question was actually a grade 7 question. It wasn't a grade 8 question. It was a probability, which we're going to start today. And your probability was, what is the probability of flipping a coin and getting heads, heads, heads on all 3 flips? So this is a tree diagram, and these things I just circled here are the first outcome. So you can either flip a heads on the coin or a tails. So let's assume you flipped a heads with your first coin. Okay. This branch here is what's going to happen on the second flip. So that second flip could be heads or tails. If you flipped a tails on the first one, it could be heads or tails on the second flip as well. But if we flipped heads on the first flip, the next one could be heads or tails. Let's pretend I flipped heads on the second flip as well. So these two branches represent the third outcome. It could be a heads or a tails. Let's assume I flipped a heads on the third one. So heads on the first flip, heads on the second flip, heads on the third flip are represented by those 3 circles that I've kind of traced over a whole bunch of times. The rest of them, this is a heads, heads, heads. This one here would be heads on the first, heads on the second, tails on the third, meaning heads, heads, tails. I'll change colors here. Heads on the first, tails on the second, heads on the third would be right here. So it would be heads, tails, heads. Then heads, tails, tails. And then I'll just kind of go tails, heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, 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 heads, and tails, tails, tails. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible combinations. Our possible outcomes as a fraction are how many different possibilities are there. That's our bottom term. And the numbers that are heads, 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 there is only one of those possibilities out of the 8 final outcomes, which means our probability as a fraction is that, or as a percentage, approximately 12.5% chance. Grade 7 math. Your grade 8 question here is your Pythagoras question. It gives you 3 side lengths and says, is this a right angle? Which means we have to use Pythagoras. So if I attach my legs here, 8 squared is 64 meters squared. 4.2 meters squared would be 4.2 times itself, which is 17.64. Add that to my 64, and this one should be 81.64 meters squared if it's a right triangle, because the area of this square plus the area of this square must equal the area of this square, which means it must be 81.64. And since it says the side length is 12.2, I know that 12 squared is 144. So it's not possible that 12.2 squared is 81.64. So therefore, no, it can't be a right triangle. Because if it was, this would be 149 or 150-ish, something like that. Okay. Your next question is 3 percentage questions, the chapter we just finished. So probably you're using a calculator for all these. 12.5% when you go through the whole rigmarole is 12.5 out of 100, which is 125 thousandths, which is this number here. So if I was using a calculator, 12.5% would be 12.5% of $40. It's $5. Your next question, 105%, is 100. Actually, it's 105%. We'll look at 0.5%. This is what it would be as a fraction. As an equivalent fraction with no decimal in the numerator. And as a mixed fraction. Sorry, that's not right. As a decimal. All right. So that would be, sorry, I forgot one step. 1 and 55 thousandths is what I forgot to do. Change that improper fraction to this and then go up to here. So if I want to find 105.5%, I really want to find 105.5% of $82. That'll be $86.51. 86.51. And the last question, what is 0.2%? Well, 0.2% would be this fraction, this equivalent fraction, and this decimal. Using a calculator, 0.2% of 12,500 is $25. Okay, so the expectation in this one is you realize how to convert this to a decimal and then think of it as a product of two numbers. Your next question is your linear relations question. So you have to make an equation to show the relationship between x and y. Once you have that, you'll be able to solve for x being 1,000. So to find your coefficient, your difference here is 6, and your difference here is 2. Your coefficient of your equation will always equal the difference of the y column divided by the difference of the x column. So the difference of the y column is 6, the difference of the x column is 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. That 3 becomes the coefficient that shows the relationship between x and y. Now once you have your coefficient, take any ordered pair between x and y and substitute them in. So in this case, x is going to be 1, so I'm going to change that to a 1. Y is going to be 20, I'm going to change that to a 20. Simplify this and see if they're equal. If they are equal, you're done, and you don't need a constant. But if they're not equal, you need to place a constant to make them equal. Now I've determined the equation that matches the table of values. And once I have that, take the value you know to find the value you don't know by substituting and simplifying. So x is 1,000. What's y? Y would be 3,017. 3,017. Volume and surface area of this one. Well, surface area, there are 6 faces, and I'm going to shade this one first. This is your left, okay? And that left and right, there's 2 of them. So there's 2 rectangles that are both going to be 8 times 6. There's 2 rectangles, this one and the other side, that are 48 each. So there's 2 that are 48, which means that those 2 together will be 96 square meters. But there's more. The front, which we'll do in red, the front is a rectangle. So there's 2 of them, the front and the back. And both of those rectangles are 10 by 6. This is 10, and this is 6. So there's 2 of them that are 60, which means that both of those, the front and back, are 120 meters squared. But wait, there's more. There's also a top and a bottom. There's 2 rectangles that make up the top and bottom. Those are 10 by 8. So there's 2 of them that are 10 by 8. There's 2 of them that are 80, which means that altogether those would be 160 meters squared. If you add all of those together, you get 280, 380 less 4 is 376 meters squared is the total surface area of that particular rectangular prism. Now the easier one, the surface area, requires a lot more computation. The volume is pretty easy because the volume of any right prism is the same formula. Area of the base times the height of the prism. So the base is a rectangle, which means we're going to go length times width multiplied by the height, or 10 times 8 multiplied by the height, which is 6, or 80 times 6, which is 480 cubic meters of space inside that big rectangular prism. Surface area measured in square meters, volume measured in cubic meters. Your next question is the volume of just a cylinder that is 60% full. So the first thing we're going to do is calculate the full volume. Same formula as before, area of the base multiplied by the height of the prism. The base is a circle, so we're going to have pi r squared multiplied by the height. We use 3 for pi because we don't have to be that exact. Multiplied by 10 squared multiplied by the height of the whole prism, which is 25. 300 multiplied by 25 is 75 plus 2 zeros. So the full volume of that cylinder would be 7,500 cubic centimeters of space. Since it's liquid, we could also say 7,500 milliliters because 1 cubic centimeter is 1 milliliter. So really, 60% of 7,500 would be that to a calculator. 60% of the 7,500 milliliters it can hold means that if it's 60% full, there are 4,500 milliliters or 4,500 cubic centimeters of space occupied by that substance. That's your answer. Your next question is your unit rate. So we have $12.40 for 120 milliliters of some liquid and $18.80 for 165 milliliters of liquid. Which one is the better deal? So I'm going to actually write it out as a rate. Then I'm going to break it down into a unit rate of 100 milliliters. Now, I'm pretty good at math, so I know that 120 divided by 1.2 equals 100. So I'm going to do it this way first. Take my $12.40, $12.40 divided by 1.2 means that it costs $10.33 repeating cents per 100 milliliters. Oh, am I recording? Yes, I am. Per 100 milliliters. Actually, 10. This line should just be above the last 3, but whatever. Your next one is $18.80 for 165 milliliters. How much is it for 100? Now this time, I might not be sure that I have to divide by 1.65. If you don't know that, the other way that we learned that you should always use for proportional reasoning is put an X there and create an algebraic equation. Now making sure your units are the same. So milliliters, milliliters, great. Dollars, dollars, great. We're okay to use this method. So 165x would be one side of my equation. The other side would be the product of 1880 and 100, which is, I can do that in my head because I just have to move it 2 times if I multiply by 100. Divide both sides by 165, and x will equal whatever 1800 divided by 165 is. That is $10.90, roughly. So both things being equal, this is slightly less money, so the better deal is $12.40 for 120 mils, but it's not significantly. It's probably about, I don't know, 5% better, maybe, something like that. A little over 5%. And your last question, I think it's your last question. It's your last one? The second last question is the same as the other one, except it's easier, right? So this time I say 126 for 8 items is equal to what for 9 items? So You could figure out what you divide 8 by to get 9, or what you multiply, 8 by to get 9, which is kind of hard to do. You could break it down into, if it's $126 for 8 of them, you could figure out what one of them is and then figure out what 9 of them is. That's a good way to do it. But since we have a lot of practice with this, we realize that using this algebraic method is probably the simplest way. I'm going to multiply across here to get 8x. I'm going to multiply across here to get the product of 126 and 9. That's not 126. That is, which is 1134. The problem with this method is it doesn't really make sense. It's just one of those things. We use the algorithm. We know it's going to get us the correct answer. The best way to increase your understanding of the concept would be to do this method. This makes sense. If it's 126 for 8, I'll figure out how much it is for 1, and then I'll refigure out how much it is for 9. This is the best method for understanding mathematics behind it, but this is the best method for figuring out the answer quickly. If you get really good at this method, this is the one you want to default to. So x will equal whatever 1134 divided by 8 is, which is $141.75. So if it's $126 for 8, it'll be $141.75 for 9 of them. And the last question is your abstract area question. So it asks you for the perimeter and area. It gives you 2 meters, it gives you 10 meters, it gives you 5 meters, it gives you 6 meters, but it doesn't give you this. So the first thing I'm going to do is calculate the area. The area seems reasonable. If I think of this question, I'll ungroup all this stuff. If I think of this question as being this rectangle right here, I know that it's going to be 10 times 5, and that rectangle will be 50. Okay? So if I think of it as a solid rectangle, the gray rectangle, take away the white triangle, will equal the odd shape, the odd looking shape. And that's what I have to kind of think about to get the answer. So since the gray rectangle would have been 10 times 5, the gray rectangle would have had an area of 50 meters squared. Now the problem with this white triangle is it doesn't appear there's any dimensions to it. So if I draw in some dotted lines here, I can see my right triangle. If this is 2, this must have been 3, because the whole side over here was 5. So now I know of my right triangle, this is 3. If this is 10, and this is 6, then this must have been 4. So now I have 2 legs of a right triangle. And since it's the area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2, it'll be 4 times 3 divided by 2, which is going to be 6. So the area of the triangle is 6 meters squared, which means the area of the gray shape, final answer, is 44 meters squared. Now the perimeter is a little trickier because now I have this, but I don't have this right here. But the good news is for perimeter, since I know 2 of the legs of that white triangle, this is really that missing dimension, which is the hypotenuse. And if you know anything about Pythagoras, you know about the 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triple. This would be 9, this would be 16, this would be 25, which makes x 5 meters. Pythagorean triple, which means your perimeter would be 2 plus 10, which is 12, 17, 23, 28 meters. Your perimeter for that odd shape would be 28 meters. Okay, so hopefully that helped you for your review. If you didn't do so well on some of the questions, 2 weeks from now you're going to forget how to do them anyway. Watch the video again in preparation for your final exam on June 20th.